high as you can.
Launching out of lockdown was always going to be tricky.
3. Whoa!
And after being warned about the velocity of its plans for schools, today the government aborted its mission.
While we are not able to welcome all primary children back for a full month before the summer, we continue to work with the sector on the next steps.
It's another change in policy that the Knight and Mead Academy in Leicester will have to prepare for.
I've included some information here about self-isolation bubbles.
The school didn't open last week for reception Year 1 and Year 6, like half of all primaries in England, because they felt it wasn't safe to do so. They're still carrying out risk assessments and will open to these years next Monday instead. Head teacher Jenny Slinger has welcomed today's announcement.
We've got a group of children here who are replanting our raised beds.
The school is near a hospital and a prison, and so demand for places for key worker children, as well as the vulnerable, has been high.
Are you relieved then that you won't have to get all children back for a month before the summer?
I think it was a big ask, and I think it's hard because we'd all love to see our children back in school, but the further we get with the planning and the logistics and the staffing and the space that we have in school, it just wouldn't have been possible.
Just like we've asked the children to do at home.
Teaching unions had been warning for weeks that it wasn't realistic for most schools to accommodate all primary year groups at the same time.
The DfE guidelines state that each desk should be 2 metres apart, like they are in this classroom, and that classes should be limited to 15 pupils. But this school has 230 pupils altogether, which would mean they'd need roughly 15 classrooms, but they have only 8. And each one can only fit 8 pupils in safely, so the numbers just don't add up. And if the guidelines don't change by September, they'll be stuck with the same problem.
I can see it.
It's the biggest disruption to children's education since the Second World War, and for some that's hard to swallow. With one head teacher survey suggesting 700,000 children aren't getting any homeschooling, campaigners say the pandemic may lead to an epidemic of educational poverty. Teresa Hodgkiss's daughter Summer has special educational needs. Mrs. Hodgkiss is frustrated that the 9-year-old will have missed so many months of school.
I think she ought to go in for a couple of days. I mean, even if it's just 2 days a week, just for a couple of hours, 2 or 3 hours, to help her, boost her what she wants, because she needs special needs. I mean, she's really, really, really behind.
9-year-old Jude and 7-year-old Melody have had to get used to homeschooling, as have their parents.
It's a bit of a struggle for us. We've had to learn some more things.
Yeah. I don't think I'd have to go back to school at my age.
It's okay, but I would like to go back to school before the summer. It's fun staying at home, and it is kind of sad that you're missing all your that you have to stay at home because you miss all your friends and your teacher.
The government says it will proceed with caution and today launched a study to monitor the prevalence of COVID in schools. But for now, for millions of children in England, education will continue to be on furlough. Darshna Soni, Channel 4 News, Leicester.
Well, joining me now is the Conservative MP Robert Halfon, who chairs the Commons Education Committee, and the General Secretary of the Association of School and College Leaders, Jeff Barton. Robert Halfon first, when you look at how few schools are fully reopened and how few pupils have gone back, isn't it a reality that both teachers and parents just aren't convinced it's safe? And that's understandable.
Of course it's understandable, and I pay tribute to the work of teachers and support staff. And it is no wonder that parents are worried. But just because some schools are not able to open, it does not mean that all schools should not open. And the problem that we face is that whilst the country is worrying about whether or not we go to football matches or have the pubs open, education will possibly hurting around 700,000 disadvantaged pupils who are not doing any school homework, as was highlighted in your report. And whilst we've got to be careful about the risk, we also need to worry about the risk of endemic educational poverty that could afflict the life chances of young children for many months to come.
Well, Jeff Barton, that's at the crux of it. It's a pretty crazy world, isn't it, that you can get a pint, but you can't take your kid to school?
Absolutely, we'd all share that concern. I think Robert and everybody else are quite right that we should be concerned about the gap between the advantage and the disadvantage. But it seems to me if the starting point had been what the starting point is in Wales, for example, which is the Cabinet Secretary saying to the teacher unions, what would we need to do to give every child in Wales an experience back in school before the summer holiday, then that collaborative approach, rather than the lofty promises being made from Number 10, which were never, for the reasons your report showed, going to be manageable, we could, I think, have worked in a more systematic collaborative way. And I don't rule that out now. I think today actually clears the way to be able to bring more young people in, but it's a pity we're starting, as it were, where we're starting.
Robert Halfon, is it government chaos to blame rather than the unions?
Oh, in a national, I'm not saying it's anybody's fault. As a national pandemic, and I appreciate the work that Jeff Barton and his union members have done. He's done this in a very cautious and deliberative way. But my worry again is for disadvantaged pupils. The Department for Education itself said that the attainment gap between disadvantaged pupils and the better off peers could reach 75%. Now that is incredibly worrying. And what is going to happen if the schools don't go back till September? It's going to be 6 months plus of the school year, 40% of the school year. What happens if the schools don't go back in September either? I think that the government does need a national strategic plan to set out a clear timetable for schools returning, but also to focus on a catch-up programme for those children who are left behind during the current crisis.
Jeff Barton, schools might not even go back in September. That's an entire generation's life chances that could be jeopardised by this, particularly those vulnerable children. What are you going to do about that?
Well, I mean, whether children go back in September will be down to the public health. What we would hope is, even if what you could do is to bring in half a year group, let's say year 10, the GCSE students, for 1 week, followed by the other half the other week, and have rotas, that would at least allow them to have contact with a teacher who can assess their needs, look at what they need in terms of the curriculum, and be able to take them through. And that's definitely what we hope will be able to happen. But there is a sense in which, what today clears the way to do is to say, instead of that 4-week guarantee of every child being back in primary, it clears the way for head teachers and their governors to say, right, in our context, who are those children who we would want to be able to bring in to reconnect with a teacher, to assess where they are. There's nothing to stop schools being able to do that in their own context if they are ready to do it. And I think there's a sense from leadership, and I represent 20,000 leaders, that they're ready to work with the profession to be able to do that. And that might not deliver, the kind of headlines which Boris Johnson particularly wanted. I do think it's what Robert is saying there. It's working on behalf of the most vulnerable children who need to be back in education.
Robert Halfon, is that kind of piecemeal approach going to cut it, or does there need to be a sort of recalibration of the risks?
Well, I think that there has to be a recalibration of risk because, as I said at the beginning, there are much risks, if not more, to children from disadvantaged backgrounds staying at home, not learning, not having access to online tablets or computers, than there is risk to children being in schools. And we know the risk is minimal, according to the World Health Organization, many other European Union countries, our own chief medical officer. So we have to weigh up these issues. We have to get our children learning again. We have to give them a chance to climb up the education ladder of opportunity. Many of them are suffering from safeguarding issues, mental health, exposure to online harms, possibly joining county gangs, difficulties with a very tough home situation. These are going to affect the children for many months to come, and we are damaging their life chances if we don't get these kids back in school sooner rather than later.